Hello guys, and welcome back to my video. So in this video, we're going to be deploying our Express.js application that we've been building all along to AWS, right? So without wasting much of the time, let's talk about the AWS services that we are going to be using, right? So the first service is going to be the ECR, right? So ECR just stands for Elastic Container Registry, which is a fully managed Docker image registry by Amazon. So if you've watched my previous video on Docker, just think of it as Docker, but it's just native to AWS, right? So some of the things that it does is that it stores Docker container images, right? So when you want to upload Docker images, you upload them to AWS using ECR, right? And then it also integrates directly with other services such as AWS ECS, EKS, and then Lambda, right? And then it supports both private and then public repositories, right? And it also provides you with versioning of your containers, image scanning, and also lifecycle policies, right? And then the other service that we are going to be using is the AWS ECS, right? So ECS just stands for Elastic Container Service, right? So it's just a long-running manager for your tasks, right? So what it means is that it keeps all your app running, and then the number of all your apps running, right? And then it ensures that the desired number of tasks are always running, right? And then it restarts if a task failed, right? It restarts them. And then so it allows you to integrate other things such as load balancers, right? So that you make sure that your server doesn't always balances the load, right? And it also supports auto scaling, right? And then when you're working with ECS, you will find that you come across what is called a task, right? So want to take a look at what is a task. So an ECS task is a running instance of a task definition, right? So a task definition is just like a blueprint for your task, right? And then this task definition defines which Docker images to use in your applications, right? It defines which Docker images to use in your application, the CPU and the memory configuration for your Docker containers, right? For them to run, you need computational power, so you define the number of CPUs and also the memory configuration, right? And also the container ports for you to expose, right? So if you have any ports that you want to expose, and then also it also allows you to define the environment variables, right? For example, if you have like MongoDB variables or Postgres variables that you want to use, right? And then also network settings, right? And then it also gives you other things such as volumes, logging, if to see if they've had any errors, and also health checks, right? And then now a task is one time or a long running execution of that blueprint, right? So you can start it manually, or it can be run by a service, right? For example, it can be run by the ECS service, right? And then the other thing that you will come across is an ECS service. So an ECS service is a long running manager for your tasks, right? So basically an ECS service just allows you to manage your tasks, right? And then it keeps your app running, ensures that the desired number of tasks are always running. And then it restarts any failed tasks. And then also it allows you to integrate with load balancers, and it also supports auto scaling, right? As you can see here, we have the feature, we have the task, and then the service, right? So the purpose of a task is to run containers, or a container or containers, right? And then the service runs containers continuously. This one runs once, right? And then launch mode, you can manual or schedule it. And then this one is auto managed and also fault tolerant, right? Scaling, you cannot scale a task, but you can scale a service, right? So it allows you, if you want to put more containers, if you have like more load, right? And then load balancer, not directly, but yeah, it's directly, right? So task recovery, no, you won't be able to restart a task when it fails. Yeah, but when you're using a service, it allows you to auto restart if it fails, right? So best use case for jobs, scripts, and then testing. And then this one, best use case for APIs, web apps, and then workers, right? And then the other thing that we need to look at is the AWS EC2, right? So an Amazon EC2 Elastic Compute Cloud is a core AWS service that provides resizable virtual machines in the cloud. So think of this one as a PC, but that PC runs on the cloud, right? Just think of it's a computer that runs on the cloud. So the Amazon EC2, it allows you to run servers on demand, right? With full control over, you have an operating system, you can install an operating system, and then you have a storage, and then a network, and then you have a CPU and run, and you also have like an installed software, right? So now that we have talked about these AWS EC services that we'll be using, now let's get our hands dirty in the code, and now let's deploy our Express.js application to AWS. Okay, guys, so now we are pushing our backend to AWS, right? So since you learned about ECS, ECR, and tasks, right? Now it's time to put our knowledge to practice, right? So here you can simply create a new AWS account, but since I already have a new AWS account, I'm going to sign in using root user email, right? And then I'm simply going to type in my email address. Okay, so now that now I'll simply all right. So now I'll simply type in my password, and then I'll simply use my fingerprint to log in, right? So now that we are on AWS console, right? So what we simply need to do is we need an elastic container registry, right? If you remember, I said that we upload our images to ECS, right? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a repository, right? So let's create a repository. So this repository, I'm just going to call it Job Board app, right? So this is the name of our repository. So we'll be pushing all our related images to the Job Board app, right? So if you go to the Job Board app, you see this view push commands, right? So this will give you like the commands to push like your images to AWS, right? So this is for Mac and Linux, and then this is for Windows, right? So you can go, you need to go to the first link, get started with Amazon ECR for you to set up AWS CLI, right? So you can go through this documentation, right? So I've already done that, so I'm not going to do that. There's simply what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to copy this link right here, and then we'll go to our backend, right? So I'm just going to go to our backend that we created here, right? And then I'm simply going to paste this command right here to allow us to log into AWS, right? So now that we are done, the next stage is I'm just going to copy this docker build command to just build our image, right? So if I go to here and simply paste this command right here, right? And then you can see now it's starting to build an image, right? Now that it's done building an image, you can simply go to copy this command where we are going to take the image that we have created, right? So now we're simply going to take that image right there, right? So now that we are done taking that image, let's copy this command for pushing that image to AWS, right? So I'm just going to paste it, and then I'm just going to push. We are simply now going to push that image to our AWS ECR, right? To our repository, right? Okay, so now that we are done, you can see we have pushed this image to AWS, right? ECR. As you can see, now we don't have an image here. But if I refresh, you can see that we now have this image, latest image. And then this is our image. And then this is our image URI. So this image URI is very important. So for now, we'll just copy this image URI right there. And then what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to go to another tab right there. And then I'm simply going to type ECS. You can simply type ECS, which is Elastic Container Registry, right? Elastic Container Registry, right? So we want to type ECS, not ECR, right? Elastic Container Service, right? So now what we are basically going to do is we need to create a cluster, right? So let's create a cluster, right? So our cluster is going to be, let's say, job board app cluster, right? And then infrastructure, we are going to use AWS Fargate, right? Which is a serverless and also pay as you go, right? If you want, you can use Amazon EC2, but you just have to do like some manual configuration, right? If you want, you can do like monitoring. You can turn on monitoring so that you can get like enhanced insights, right? But I'm not going to do that. So now I'm simply going to create a cluster, right? Okay, so now that our cluster is done, you can see now we don't have no running tasks, right? So basically now just going to our task, right? And then now we are going to create a service. So a service is best when you are creating something like our backend for web APIs or web apps, right? And then you can also do tasks, right? So I'm just going to create and then we are going to search for the task definition here is going to be, right? So the task definition, we need to create a task definition here before we create a cluster, right? So I had created this one, but I'm just going to create another one, right? So I'm just going to call it job board app task, right? Job board app task. We are going to use AWS Fargate here. And then for operating system, I'm just going to choose Linux ARM64 since I use Mac, right? You can also choose Windows depending on your operating system, right? And then task row, we'll just leave it like that. And then the container, you can see here we have what we call container one. Now we need the name of our container here. So I'm just going to call it job board, right? And then that repository URI, if you go back to our ECR, right? This is the URI that we need here. You can copy this URI, right? Simply paste it here, right? And then the port is going to be 6013 since 6013 right here. Container port is also going to be 6013, right? So now we are done with the port part. If you want, you can configure other things like monitoring also, but I'm not going to do that, right? I'm simply not going to do that. You can also include environment variables here. So now let's create our task here. So now that we have created our task, right? No, we do that. Now that we created our task, let's go back to our job board app cluster, right? So now let's create a service, right there, and then job board app task, right? Let's use that one. And then this is the task definition, right? And then service name, and then launch type we are going to use Fargate, right? And then you can configure other things like load balancing, but I'm not simply going to do that. And then let's create the task. Let's create the service, right? As you can see now, this service is still running, right? It's still deploying. So let's just give it like a few minutes for it to finish setting up, right? As you can see, 0 out of 1 task is running. So that means that our task is still in progress, right? So let's just wait for it to finish, and then we can configure other things that are left to configure, right? Right, so now we have a task which is now running, right? So the next thing that we need to do is we go to configuration and networking, right? So once you go to configuration network, go to security groups, right? So there under security groups, what we want to do is we want to configure the network, right? So we want to allow our application to communicate with every other network, right? So what we simply have to do here is we'll add a rule, and then all traffic, right? Custom, and then we are going to allow every other, and then we'll allow anyway, right? And then we'll save the results, right? And then now that we have added a security group, let's go back to ECS. And then job app cluster, right? And then we want to go to the tasks, right? So if you go to the task, you'll see we have this public IP, right? This is our public IP. If you copy that, and then let's go to our postman, right? Let's run our postman. Let's see if it's working, right? So if you go to our postman right here, I'm just going to paste our public IP here, and then let's send. As you can see, now we are getting the vacancies from our, from what? Now from our AWS instead of what? Our local host, right? So as you can see, we have deployed our job board application. We started from scratch, from building the backend up to deployment, right? So thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.